Good morning, everyone. I'm going to wait here about 30 more seconds as people start filing in. I'm excited about today's webinar. Should be a good one. It'll be a little different today. So you guys get to stare at me for a minute here. You know, while we were waiting, everyone could go to the ITS Heartland website and click on our sponsors. As you know, they're important for this webinar series. So if you don't want to just stare at me. All right, well, we're a minute past. I'm sure people will keep filing in, but good morning. I once again get to welcome all of you ITS Heartland members back for week 4 of the 2020 ITS Heartland webinar series. My name is Kurt Rotering, and I am the current past president of ITS Heartland and the traffic team leader at Olsson in Kansas City. Also, behind the scenes today and with all these webinars is your current president, Slade Ingstrom, a vice president of Trans Systems out of Wichita. So I always want to thank him for producing these things and keeping us on track. So if you missed one of the last week's sessions, the recordings have been posted to the ITS Heartland website. Just go to the annual meeting link on the website, and a link to the recordings are kind of down and on your left side next to the week's date. This week is being recorded as well, so with our great discussion that will be had today, if you missed something or want to go back, those will always be held on the website. So as I mentioned, today is a little different from our previous 3 weeks. We'll have our normal great vendor updates, but then we'll have ITS America's Mobility on Demand Alliance provide an hour or so long discussion about mobility on demand and what's going on in the country. So, and then we'll wrap up with another one of our favorite state updates. This one will be from Missouri. So before we get started, I obviously want to thank our sponsors, which you can see behind me. Their generous support has allowed us to provide these sessions to all of you for free. So thank you to HNTB, Trans Systems, Walter P. Moore, ADCO, Street Smart, Snyder and Associates, Econolite, HDR, Olsson, SRF, JEO, TransCore, General Traffic Controls, and Image Sensing Systems. So thank you to all of you sponsors. Links to their websites are all on the ITS Heartland website as well, so please go and visit them and see what products and services they have to offer. With that, as we get going, please post any questions to the Q&A tab on the top right of your screen. Please especially use this function today during the MOD Alliance discussion. I'm sure Amy will be asking for your input, and it'll be important to ask questions and provide answers and all that. So please use that Q&A tab on the top right. All right, to get this week number 4 of the ITS Heartland webinar series started, we'll have a couple vendor updates. First is from our friends at Sensys Networks. Sensys Networks delivers leading vehicle detection solutions and a traffic data platform that expands as needs grow. So Sensys, take it away.
Cycling in cities can be dangerous, frustrating, and full of stops and starts. If only there was a way for the road to look out for cyclists. Presenting Give Me Green. Now you can get detected automatically up to 300 feet from the intersection. This is the new way cyclists can keep moving through the city safely and easily. Cyclists just access the Give Me Green app before they ride. After starting Give Me Green, the app will pick up the cyclist's location via GPS. The user will see the signal status of the intersection they're approaching. The app communicates via Bluetooth with equipment at the intersection. And when the rider crosses a virtual detection zone, they're alerted that they've been detected.
Traffic signal alerted.
The signal will then change to green based on the timing plan programmed into the traffic controller. All that's needed at the intersection is a Bluetooth antenna and the Sensys Networks Flex Control and Flex Connect modules. Once the riders start the app, they'll be detected at equipped locations using secure encryption. which means not having to press the crossing button. Give Me Green offers flexible options for cyclists and agencies, including an in-app green light countdown and directional user input. Plus, agencies can trigger green extensions and caution signs for crossing cyclists, all of which improves safety and traffic flow for everyone in shared lanes and bike paths. Move towards your Vision Zero goals with Give Me Green.
Great, thank you. Next, we'll have another vendor update, this one from SES America. Sunrise SESA, or SES America, is an ITS solution manufacturer providing dynamic message signs and retrofit packages across the USA. Mohammed Miah, Vice President of Sales in their Western region, will provide an overview of what they can offer. So take it away.
Greetings, ITS Heartland. My name is Mohammed Miah. I'm with Sunrise SESA, also known as SES America. We are a manufacturer that specializes in DMS technology as well as other LED technology. Our emphasis is in the ITS industry as well as transit and commercial spaces. Our ITS vision is to take what's already out there and make it better. On top of that, we constantly innovate new technology. We have support all across the country from a local level, regional, as well as national distribution. And we offer various solutions and top-notch customer support. Our product offerings start at the Messenger series, which is the standalone DMS signs. We have them in front access, walk-in, as well as rear access. And you can get those same signs with solar power capabilities. We're also the pioneer in retrofitting signs. So if you have any old signs, we can bring them back to life and we can restore them, make them brand new again. You can go from amber to amber, amber to full color. And now we can even change the pitch. If you have a larger pitch and you want a tighter pixel matrix, we can offer that as well. And we also offer a full range of mobility products, which are blank out signs, lane control signs, and variable speed limit signs. One of our goals is to help you maximize your budgeting as well as your available funding. And with that, our products will give you a long-term savings, as well as lower installation costs. The systems are not as complex as older systems. And of course, if you're in areas where you don't have power, solar solutions are definitely the way to go. Our products are simple to operate and maintain. We can provide full turnkey solutions with minimal technical training required. We offer a full warranty, lifetime tech support, as well as a ready-to-ship parts inventory because we manufacture everything right here in the US, in Pembroke, Massachusetts. When you work with us, you get a dedicated technician as well as an account manager. Our solutions are customizable as well as standard off the shelf. And of course, we provide equipment mentoring and product training. Visit our website at www.sesamerica.com to access various resources ranging from product specs, data sheets, as well as downloadable guides, and we can also offer customized designs and quotes. Here's my contact information. Don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. All right, this next discussion is with MOD Alliance, and I'm really excited about it. The MOD Alliance was created by ITS America to help shape the future of mobility, striving for a world that is safer, greener, smarter, and more equitable. The MOD Alliance is composed of public agencies and private sector companies working together to advance mobility on demand priorities. ITS Heartland was originally planning on having full-day MOD Alliance discussion forums in cities throughout our regions with Amy Ford and the MOD Alliance partners. We were only able to hold the Kansas City forum before COVID hit, so we had to sadly cancel all the rest of them. The Kansas City forum was a huge success with discussion from multiple key stakeholders in the KC region. So I'm sad we won't be able to bring this show on the road like previously planned, but I think today's discussion will be a good alternative. Leading today's discussion is Amy Ford. Amy is currently the Vice President of Policy Programs and Mobility on Demand at ITS America. Previously, Amy worked at the Colorado Department of Transportation as the Chief of Advanced Mobility and was heavily involved in the RoadX program. Amy also went to high school in our ITS Heartland region. She actually grew up in Leavenworth and spent a lot of time around the Kansas City region, so is very familiar with the ITS Heartland region. So with that, Amy, I'll let you take it away.
Excellent. Thanks, Kurt. Well, we're excited to be here today and really have a conversation. And the interesting part of what we were doing with the Mobility on Demand Heartland series was how we engage you and how we engage the different stakeholders in talking about this program and these ideas of mobility. And we've actually assembled a great panel today to have that discussion. And as we do this, and as we introduce them, and they start talking about mobility on demand, I actually wanted to ask you all a question first. So if you can do this in your live thing, and we'll see if we can do this, pop into your bottom screen and you're going to see a show Q&A, and I'm going to type you a question, and we're going to be able to look at this question. And I'm going to say, what is your definition of mobility on demand? And the reason I ask that is because I think some of the questions that we get and the conversation that we have happen is everyone comes at this a little bit differently. And I think it's important to sort of coalesce around what we mean when we talk about mobility on demand, but also why are we talking about it in the context of ITS and intelligent transportation systems? Is it the technology capacity behind the scene that facilitates mobility in a different way that frankly customers weren't used to 10 years ago? What are the tools that people are using when we start creating this concept of what it means to be on demand? Is it just about mobility services? What about our infrastructure services? How do we think about operations? How do we think about the integration between different mobility modes, whether it be from scooters to transit, to even our highways and our tolling systems, to our curb access? How do we think about this? So that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. We've got a great panel to do this with you, and let me just sort of introduce them ever so briefly. But then I wanted to ask them a question as we get going into this, and as you all then respond to the question that I was asking you. So Andy Taylor is the Director of Strategy with Cubic, and I dare say that Cubic is the granddaddy of them all when it comes to really the platforms and the mobility platforms behind the scenes, whether it be from transit to fare collections to tolling to other enterprises, and how they think about weaving together people's access to be able to pay and to use mobility systems. Derek Fretheim is with First Transit, and he is the Director of Innovation with First Transit. And First Transit is one of the largest third-party, if you will, contractors and suppliers of transit around the country, and working with transit agencies all around, and really moving in an innovative space in a variety of different areas. He's going to talk a little bit about that. Valerie Lefler is the Executive Director of Feonix Rising, and Feonix Mobility Rising is actually a nonprofit out of Nebraska that has really put a now national footprint on the idea of mobility on demand in rural and even suburban areas. This is not just a purview of urban areas, and I'm going to chat a little bit about that. And lastly, we're joined by Jeremey Johnson Miller, and Jeremey is currently now the communications director with the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center. And prior to that, he was the former statewide mobility coordinator with the Iowa DOT. So we're excited to have them on board. And so the first question that we wanted to ask them to talk about today is really, what is, if you had to say the main problem, and I say this, the main problem statement that we're trying to solve in transportation, and what would that be, and how does mobility on demand solve this? And in doing so, talk a little bit, Andy, I'll let you do this, set the stage with Cubic and what you do on sort of these back-end platforms and how that's critical to making it happen.
Thanks, Amy. That's a big question to get into sort of 5 or 7 minutes, so let me have a go. So Cubic provides all of the back-end systems. So if you've ever been to New York or the Bay Area, LA, Atlanta, Miami, all of the ticketing systems that you use are our sort of key technologies. Now that gives us a valuable insight into the way people are moving around the city. Now the next question comes, how can you bring in other forms of mobility as well? So how can we introduce bike share into this? How can we introduce sort of tolling systems so we can start incentivizing behaviors? You know, if we see that you're using a toll road 5 times a day, can we incentivize your behavior to basically use public transport for one of those 5 days? So we're trying to shift load and manage the network. And what we're seeing in cities now is people sort of looking towards new mobility to try and manage the mobility network holistically. This is not about managing in silos anymore. This is about sort of managing public transportation, private car usage, freight access to cities. It's about how you manage this all together. And the only way you can do that with any degree of reliability is by connecting all of these different systems. Now, a lot of systems that were built several years ago, very bespoke systems, very sort of locked in technology, it's hard to sort of free up those sort of solutions. What we're looking at now is people are evolving to cloud-based solutions, the more open APIs, and that's really driving the ability to connect all of these different networks together. One of the key things is about how we manage data and how we manage security, and that's obviously sort of built into the ecosystem that we're looking at. But one final point that I'll mention quickly that I'm pretty sure we're going to come back to. The last 5 years for mobility as a service and mobility on demand have been very much driven by the private sector. It's the commercial organizations, the commercial mobility service providers and mass operators that have really forcefully pushed that discussion. And they've done a great job of promoting what private mobility solutions can do to augment public managed infrastructure and public transportation. We're now at a point, though, where we're pivoting. What I've sort of classified as mass 1.0 is now pivoting to mass and mobility on demand 2.0. Cities are now waking up to the fact that private mobility services can actually help augment what they're providing for cities. It helps them sort of better manage the solutions that they have. We are now seeing cities around the world stand up and take control of mobility. And they are looking towards the private mobility service providers and private solutions to basically add on and grow the capability. COVID has given them a real chance to basically review their entire mobility network and look at how things need to change for the future. People are sort of voting with their feet, and unfortunately they're getting back in their cars and sort of, you know, we're seeing traffic levels come back to sort of previous norms that like from last year, specifically in Baltimore, just up the road from where I am. They're seeing traffic at 20% levels than what it was previously. So now cities are now being forced into that discussion about how we manage mobility. And I think this is the prime time for cities to really start reviewing how private mobility can come together to deliver mobility on demand and help deliver policy and equity for everybody that operates in the city.
Andy, thanks. You know, and it's interesting as we are asking this question to our audience about mobility on demand and sort of what is it. One person was like, I don't know, and you know, I really have no idea. And so why am I sitting here listening to this? But you sort of talked about it from a demand responsive services, and demand responsive is an interesting idea. And frame that really quickly, because it'll transition me then over to Derek as we talk about what was more of a traditional type of service and how they're continuing to evolve. But how do you see sort of this demand responsive? What do you define by that?
For me, demand responsive transport is the likes of sort of Via vans and Chariot while they still existed. It's about how we can use private mobility service providers being called to specific locations to pick up people and take them to the nearest transit stop. It's how can we effectively extend the transit network, but do it in a fashion that sort of fits with people's needs. Now, there are a whole bunch of other issues to deal with respect to people's access to these services. Not everybody has a smartphone, not everybody has a credit card, not everybody is savvy enough to actually use those services. So managing equity and access is always going to be critical as well. So, it may come down to somebody ringing a free phone number and booking a service to get you to the public transportation network. But it really is about not relying on running around huge empty buses in the middle of the day. It can now be that we have a sort of on-demand service that brings you to the next node on the public transport network and gets you to where you need to be that way instead. It's a more economical and efficient way of doing things.
Yeah, and that I think is the question we'll want to get into the economics of this. And someone else responded and said, thank you. The way they defined it is transportation to move myself or goods that I need, when and where I want, however I want it. And, you know, as I transition to Derek as the start with this sort of question of this single problem that we're trying to solve in transportation right now, and then how First Transit has been involved in this and sort of changing and evolving. And actually, you've done some work in the region as well, if I'm not mistaken. And so how do you see First Transit sort of taking this and transitioning, which has been a very successful and long time strategy from a transportation delivery perspective, and evolving it? Derek.
That's a good question. You know, First Transit is operating or managing, you know, over 300 transit properties, and so we're engaged with moving people around, working with cities and others to offer good public transit service. I think the biggest challenge that we really face in this mobility on demand, mobility as a service, is we really are trying to change behavior, right? I mean, that's the bottom line. Yeah. We've created a kind of this seamless travel experience with single occupant vehicle travel, but behavior change is not just with the individual; it's also with the institutional folks who manage those services. And if we're really going to develop a solution where there's seamless travel experiences, we need to take friction out of the system, right? And that's where, you know, my job as Director of Innovation is to look at how we can leverage our know-how, leverage our experience, partner with others, because we can't just do it by ourselves. We need to partner. And how do we, you know, cooperate with integration elements? We talk about this mobility as a service app that rules them all. And the reality is technology is really an enabler. It enables people to get to different choices. It enables things like common payment systems, multimodal journey planning, you know, those types of pieces. But it really, to Andy's point, you know, requires us to look at the policy pieces that are connected to that. So, you know, I have seen a shift in the last, you know, couple of years where cities who are managing mobility and brokering that mobility and often coordinating it really take a stand up and say, okay, here's what we need from our mobility service providers in order to ensure that we are understanding how mobility is working in our service area. They're leveraging data sources, they're requiring data elements, they're requiring you know, integration pieces. Andy mentioned open APIs. This is often something that we talk about, but when you really start to talk about pulling this together, and this is where I'm in the middle of, is I have to have this vendor be willing to cooperate with this vendor in order to ensure that that seamless experience occurs. And that doesn't always happen. And so the question is, who's responsible for ensuring that cooperation happens? We call it coopetition in some vernacular. But that really is the challenge that I think we are focused on. I often talk about where did we see sea of change happen in embracing technology? And I use the financial services industry as an example, right? So today I can take a picture of a check and I can make it a deposit. Amy, if you and I go out to dinner and I want to, and you pay, and I go, oh, you know, I'm going to Venmo you some money. We've taken friction out of managing our money and ensuring that we can pay across a platform. And all of it's enabled through some form of smart device, right? And it's in a highly regulatory type of environment. That is our barometer. That's what the public is looking at when they say, why can't I get from point A to point B and understand where, you know, what my options are, if I want fastest time or if I want cheapest route or I want to be green, you know, why can't I get that and make it a complete seamless experience? And so that's our challenge, is that we already have an industry that's proven and embraced technology, but it did take policy change to ensure that happened. So we can use that as a kind of an example, but it is a measurement tool for us. And that's the big challenge. So for First Transit, our goal really is to help our agency partners innovate, right? What does that mean? It's not necessarily technology. It is about process change, and change management is a challenge. We're an industry that hasn't absorbed technology quickly. We're late adopters. but we can no longer think in those ways. And I think the private sector has kind of pushed us to the realities of we need to start working together. We need to start thinking differently on how we're managing mobility, and that's a big undertaking. And we're not going to solve these challenges individually. We have to work together to make that happen.
Right. And, First Transit is also, you guys have had the capacity, let's say with Lawrence, to how you think about first mile, last mile, more responsive kinds of rides. But I think you drew out a good point, which is this underpinning of the technology elements. And this is why we're sitting here with ITS America, and why we're sitting here in the ITS Heartland discussions is, for so long the technology, and for instance, the great sponsors that we had before, how do you create identification with bicyclists and pedestrians who get to more of a zero deaths capacity? How do we use technology in our signage? The technology in managing mobility is really what was transformed in the last 10 years. And then it enabled the rise of mobility services that were coming in that, new providers and such as you guys and your partnerships are doing. But Valerie, the interesting piece to this is the presumption that these services were really the purview of a city and that they were only in a city. And, we were going to be in Des Moines with our next event when we were talking about our Heartland series. And one of the things that we were looking at was the interesting part of Uber now being statewide in Iowa and offering services statewide in a very different environment. But part of what you've been doing with Feonix Rising is how do you create this on-demand nature in communities where maybe traditionally you wouldn't have thought that it would have gone. And so maybe talk a little bit about that and how you're solving these problems from a transportation perspective.
Sure, of course. So I think when we look at mobility on demand in rural environments and Uber and being statewide in Iowa, I think if you go to some of those rural farm towns, you're not going to find Uber, quote unquote, statewide in those particular areas. And so I think the role that Feonix plays is helping facilitate kind of the governance structure. So for example, when we look at MOS and MOD in Finland, they created national legislation that they passed to enable this co-opetition and to enable this framework to be effective. And when we look at that in the US and when we look at these rural and small urban communities, there has to be another way to kind of facilitate the policy framework to being established. And so what Feonix does is we partner with community regional planning organizations, we partner with municipalities, we partner with nonprofits that are addressing particular social determinants of health needs to really be that integrator. So we work with the technology partners, we work with the transportation vendors, we work on the marketing side, we work on handling the customer experience. And so what we do is work alongside those partners to really put the pieces together. And how MOS looks in, for example, Western Nebraska compared to how MOS looks in Kansas City are very different. And we have experience with the AARP Ride at 50 Plus program implementing a mobility as a service framework that really looks at a community such as Columbia, South Carolina, that is kind of like an urban core, but there's a ton of suburbs that surround it. But we also have an FTA IMI award in Duluth, Minnesota, that we're going to be deploying with a large transit agency in that particular community. And so we're working in these spaces where there's incredibly different challenges from an adoption perspective. The technology is the very first piece of the puzzle, but all of those other components, such as who are those vendors that go into these ecosystems. So for example, in Columbia, South Carolina, Dallas, and then also now adding Washtenaw County and Ann Arbor, we have Uber, we have Lyft, we have the public transit, mobile ticketing, we have first and last mile, we have wheelchair accessible providers, family operated taxis, and then these kind of nonprofit providers, and then our volunteer drivers. But when we look at more rural ecosystems, such as the program we're launching in Minnesota, we have the public transit, they have a flex demand as well as a deviated fixed route service. And then on top of it, they have a large volunteer force, 240 volunteers covering 8 counties that are filling that gap. There is Lyft and Uber in Duluth, but once you get outside of that area, they cover 22,000 square miles. You're not going to find those on demand. Demand might be that afternoon or next day, but if you're looking at a lot of other options before, there was nothing. And so for Feonix, when we work in these community partners or work with these community partners to bring the MOS, to design the MOS, we create stakeholder groups called mobility leadership circles. And those community partner organizations are invested in not just the changing of the behavior, because particularly in rural communities or small urban, it is really tough to say, now you're going to give up your car. What we traditionally do in these small urban and rural communities are really focusing on how do we ensure that those who do not have mobility ecosystems available to them due to financial assistance, license status, whatever, have a new ecosystem at all. And so when it comes to changing behavior, it's really about enabling them to have that mobility ecosystem for them to book a ride, to get to work, to get access to care, to say, okay, my eyesight is no longer safe for me to drive at night or in a big city. So now I'm alternating to changing versus staying at home. I now can call for a volunteer driver, or I can call for a taxi, or I can call for, I now know how to use the bus because it's so much more integrated as part of the fabric of a lot of these community conversations. When we're talking about the transportation, it's not just the bus, it's the bus that gets me to the doctor, the bus that gets me to school, the bus that gets me to work, the bus that gets me to these places. In addition to that, these are these other modalities that I can use, or these other resources I can use to complement the public transit, or if there is no public transit, the volunteer drivers are really kind of the mod or MOS that's facilitated as a result of that.
Well, and it's interesting because a couple comments came in as Derek was chatting and as you were starting, and one person was commenting, they said, is mobility on demand really moving beyond personal vehicle ownership as the primary method of travel? And there's a lot of discussion about that. Should it have that goal? Should it be just more about creating modal choice and giving people options? And I think that's an interesting piece. But another comment that I think framed out, and this is interesting, I'd love for your thought process on this, is perhaps the behavior has already changed when we were talking about changing behavior, and I think it goes to Derek's, and for ride hailing, expectations of integrated payment. And the transportation industry now is just trying to wrap its arms around this change and to shape it and sustain it. And do you see it as that it's already changed, or do you see the kind of work that given the nature of who we have involved here, that you're really introducing something new conceptually into the industry, especially in these different areas, realize?
Derek, do you want to take that first, or you want me to?
You're welcome to take first stab at it. I think, to be clear, we've created a system, even in our roadway system, to support single occupant vehicle travel, right? And so, I talked about behavior change and policy change, and that also includes land use policies, right? I think COVID, in my mind, when we see ridership erosion to the degree that we saw, kind of allowed us to go, oh, what should we be doing better? That's the way I looked at it. But I do think that, part of the discussion that we've been having as we've seen ridership start to creep back up is, and I had this conversation with somebody just on Monday, public transit probably is a better, safer solution to move people around in a COVID type of situation because of all the requirements that we have to instill with bus cleaning and social distancing and the like. And you may not have that in some of the private sector services. I'm not saying you don't have it. I'm just saying you may not have it to the degree that the public transit operator is, because we're regulated to do so. And I think that's part of some of the conversation that needs to occur is, does our existing mobility on demand with respect to ride hailing service, does it increase the issues that we have with managing mobility, or does it decrease it? I think the verdict is still out and there's debate on both sides. But I'm seeing, more cooperation on our side where we have ride providers asking us to help them specifically with wheelchair accessible vehicle rides and the like. This is bringing up that equity piece. So that's, I'll turn it back to you, Valerie, and see what you have.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the small urban or the rural, the behavior change in terms of the shift is really twofold. I mean, one could be in looked at as one of the goals of our FTA IMI grant is to create linkages between the public transit, using one transit to then get to another. In urban, that's many times done without even a second thought, but in rural, that's a very uncommon experience in some of these networks. And so I think there's some behavior change in terms of, I'm going to take a volunteer or a Lyft or a microtransit service to get to the fixed route. And then the fixed route I will take to another service, or I'm going to go from one demand response service to another demand response service. That's a change in behavior that we're going to be particularly looking at with that deployment. When we see change in behavior and customers saying, I'm going to change my mode, seniors in particular, we're seeing are risk averse to traveling at all. And what we're seeing in our MOS ecosystems from COVID in particular is the small businesses are barely hanging on by their fingertips to stay in this industry. I mean, there's providers in Dallas that have laid off 60 drivers, and in smaller communities, there's providers that literally who used to have a staff of 4, and now the owner is the operator, is the dispatcher, is the driver, and they're just trying to keep it together. And in our small urban and rural communities, those providers and those small businesses are a huge piece of MOS. And so I think there's some interesting dynamics at play when it comes to changing the user's experience from saying, okay, I'm going to abandon my car. In rural, that's not necessarily the practical application. In rural in particular, we say those individuals without a car now have an option. And that's what is really about.
Well, and that's actually probably a great transition to Jeremey, because Jeremey, given the role that you're doing and your comment about sort of aging as well as folks with disabilities, but then also your experiences in Iowa and how people looked at mobility on demand, mobility as a service, the experience that the many transit agencies were there, but the DOT was a player in this and coordinating that. And as you get talking on this topic in regards to this, I also want to ask our audience a question, and as they weigh in on this, about behavior in the general public. Does the general public even think about mobility as a service? Do they want it? What's their expectation? And what happens if those services come and go, just like Valerie is talking about? What happens when that goes? So I'm going to send that question out to you. I'd love your thoughts as you're responding to this. And Jeremey, talk a little bit about what you've seen in your experiences and how you manage this, why it's important from a DOT perspective as well.
I think I'm going to back up to several years ago when the FTA was providing ITS grants. And so at that time, all of our rural transit systems were really jumping on those opportunities to get into the technology world in terms of scheduling software, just trying to get away from paper pencil tracking of their system. And so once we got to that point, we got established, started moving into a comfortable space, and then back to the previous question, transportation industry is now trying to wrap our arms around MOS and mobility on demand. We've gotten comfortable with this, especially in Iowa, we have 35 transit systems. They all have different platforms. Several communities have bike share options, and they have their own app. And so we get to that place of, okay, well, now what do we do? Because we already have our own app. We've invested a lot of money into this app, and now we're being put into this conversation of, hey, you should probably do this. You should probably get into this world. But then when you look at rural America, you don't have that population base. You don't have that automatic ride option. And so Valerie kind of talked about it, and I appreciate that, is that you're going to have a certain rural community that is, you may have 1 or 2 Uber trips a week, or and at the same time, our transit systems are trying to also have those 1 or 2 trips a week. And so, you're going to have that play. And a note that I took is that a lot of our rural communities have sort of a quasi taxi service too. So how does that play? You have this established taxi service, or, the community member that helps their other neighbor go to the grocery store. Does that come into play too? Because that is definitely rural America when we're talking about this mobility on demand idea, because in a lot of rural communities, it's neighbor to neighbor. It's the public transit option for demand responsive service that fills those gaps. And then when you throw in technology and try to implement new ideas, then you're throwing those smaller companies out the window and saying, well, we don't need you anymore. We're going to have this brand new system. And so it's kind of we're kind of in between, I would say. So trying to answer this question was hard, because especially in Iowa, we have 2 communities with bike share. We have no communities with scooters. We have Uber and Lyft. However, the state rules and guidelines indicate that the city has to elect to allow it. And so Uber and Lyft can't just say, I'm going to go to this town. They have to go before the city council to elect to use that service. And so there really is only a handful, and they're in the urban areas. So when you're outside of those urban areas, you're not going to get that service. And so then it comes back to public transit, and that was my previous role with Iowa DOT, is trying to make that connection between the rural areas and that shift of healthcare providers going from rural areas, moving into the specialty world of the larger urban areas, and how to make that connection between work, healthcare, daily life, but still maintaining their aging in place type of mentality.
Well, and I think that's a really good point, and it's a good question. It's one that we got as we were talking here, and sort of the public's perception of this. But Andy, I think that, and maybe I'll ask all my panelists to come back on as we sort of continue a conversation, and I'd love to invite our audience to ask questions as well of our panelists. But when we talk about managing and operating this, who should be in charge? And I think I had not heard that with Iowa sort of needing to dictate and authorize, if you will, from city to city, the involvement of, let's say, a ride sourcing partner, which is great. See, I'm learning now on this session as well. I wasn't aware of that. But who should be the boss in regards to this? And Andy, you alluded to this a little bit before, sort of this idea of 2.0, but in some instances, depending on where states are and that kind of thing, 1.0 hasn't even showed up, but as we move into the 2.0 side, what do you think? Who should be sort of the player here, or the boss entity, or is it really about a partnership? And do we have the capacity and the policies to do that right now?
Good questions. First of all, I don't think you have to follow the sequential order that you've got to go all the way through 1.0 to get to 2.0. It's like 5G technology. You'll turn your phone on, it'll just connect to 5G. So you don't have to live through 1.0 first and all of that heartache that brings. I think the people who own it has to be the cities, the regions, the public transport organizations. It's the public bodies that are responsible for delivering mobility. If you look around the world where at different sort of locations where private mobility services have been allowed to sort of just come in and sort of work at their own sort of speed, they've had major impacts on the traffic and on public transportation. You look at the sort of bike share and scooter share in San Francisco that created so much urban pollution, I'm going to call it, basically bikes and scooters scattered all over the sidewalks. They had to go through heavy regulation and limit that down to a key number of providers. You look at the impact that Uber had on the public transport and congestion in London. They had to go through a whole set of regulation there. You look at sort of bike share schemes in Singapore, where they took a whole load of customers' money and then sort of folded overnight, and so the public was sort of out of pocket. It's that sort of level of control and regulation of those private mobility service providers means the cities have got to stand up and take control. And that's what we're seeing now. We are seeing agencies sort of coalesce the management of policies across different verticals within the public body to basically come up with a common solution that's how you deliver mobility. So in my mind, and from what I'm seeing sort of globally now, cities standing up and taking responsibility for how you deliver mobility, and you ensure equity, and you deliver the policies, be it environmental, congestion, social equity, access to education, access to healthcare. All of those key things can only be delivered by the city and the region taking control. And that is not to say that there is no need for cooperation with private mobility service providers. We can have open and honest conversations about how we share data, which areas of operation do we need. But in certain areas, it has to be the city taking control. In populous areas where you've got traffic issues in the morning, the last thing you need is single ride occupancy, ride hailing services running into your central business district as well, adding to the congestion. So it needs to be that maybe you should be limiting the likes of Uber and Lyft operating at certain times of the day. Maybe it is you should be promoting demand responsive transport over sort of the sort of regular bus services at certain times of the day in certain locations. And it's only the city that can manage the holistic mobility network for a region that can actually define how private mobility can operate. And in putting those definitions together, I think that's where we'll start to see the business models work out for both the public and the private. Because let's take a reality check. There's not many private mobility service providers that have actually turned a profit in the last 5 years. And this is what frightens a lot of cities going forward, because how can they invest time and effort in working with these private mobility service providers if you don't know the money's not going to run out? That's been an issue globally. So this is how we have to sort of do it now. It's about cities taking ownership, bringing people in on a sort of limited, cautious basis, and basically delivering mobility for all of the citizens.
You know, Andy, you really bring up a really good point. And again, let me ask all of our panelists to turn on their video. I might not see everyone right now, but is about transportation. And I've often said this, that all of transportation is subsidized. All of it, from our roads to our auto manufacturers, to our transit, to our trains, to our airlines, to the entire system. And so the expectation that private mobility providers like Lyft and Uber and others are somehow going to magically make money in this industry, which is often a partnership, let's be honest, in how this works, is interesting. And I often frame that 2.0 that you talked about, Andy, is one that is an intersection between private dollars coming into this along with public dollars and subsidies, if you want to call them that, but being able to sort of manage that process more effectively. And Derek, I guess the question that I would ask you, and this is about sort of this ability to pivot with organizations like First Transit, which have been delivering bus service for a long time as a partner with these transit agencies, do our public agencies, do our public and our partnerships with contractors like First Transit, do they have the capacity to pivot and actually manage this kind of process? Do we have, to your point, Andy, the policy know-how, the capacity within our procurement perspective, the capacity within the policy development, the ideas on what we might want to do on fee setting or otherwise, or even then the services that we offer themselves, do we have the capacity to do that yet? And Valerie and Jeremy, I'd love you guys' thoughts on that too, given the experiences you've had.
I think to Andy's point, and I agree wholeheartedly with what he's outlined, is that we are playing catch up. Our cities are starting to play catch up a bit with respect to the policy, and they have a responsibility to the general public. What I haven't yet seen is a blending of the system manager, so this is traffic systems, the ITS portion, and the public transport sector pulling together, right? So I had presented a concept about 4 years ago where if we're using traffic data and we understand, and this was in Southern California where traffic, I used to say traffic is job security, right? So I was in the transportation business, you could say that. But I always wondered why we didn't do a better job with the 511 solution with the operators. Like, we know where congestion is always occurring. Why don't we push out notifications to individuals and to providers, whether it's public or private? Hey, we know that there's congestion that always occurs at 5 o'clock in this corridor. Why aren't we pushing more public transit? Why aren't we incentivizing people to not drive through that area or to pull their ride? So, we talked about, where COVID has really impacted small business. About 70% of the small businesses in downtown Portland, where I live, may not recover, right? It's that bad here. And so the question is, how can we delay your trip by having you go to your local restaurant or shop, retailer, to delay the travel through that, that congested pipeline? We can only push so much through there. Why aren't we pulling this all together? What we're doing is we're recognizing that some of the cities aren't yet there, right? And so what's our responsibility? Our responsibility at First Transit is to help them manage mobility. And they may not be equipped, especially the smaller agencies where you have your director of marketing also managing customer service, and then getting on the phone sometimes for dispatch, right? So they're wearing different hats, but we look at it as our responsibility to help guide them through the process. And what's our role? Should we be the coordinator? Should we help them create the policies, identify their priorities, and then help instill the management of that? So rather than having multiple contracts with, your micro transit provider, your bike, share, mobility on demand or transportation on demand, micro transit, like, why couldn't we be like the master services agreement provider to coordinate all that activity? So these are things that are that we're caused to look at. But I really think that we're starting to see that shift occur, where cities are taking back some of their responsibilities and ensuring that the services, the data is connected to it, are all cohesive.
Yeah. Well, and Jeremy and Valerie, one of the questions that just came in, and it's following on Andy's comments, and so maybe you all could sort of jump in and talk about this. The question was this: what are the 2 to 3 issues that a community should address in policy to be in charge? And I'm going to air quote it because they quoted it. So what are the 2 or 3 policies? And maybe Valerie, I'll start with you, given what you are seeing as you especially are working in smaller town environments as you start launching mobility on demand.
I think there's a couple of pieces that this could play into with regard to the cities or the community and regional planning organizations. I think one of them is in particular with a focus on supporting, innovative models. So the FTA and various cities and counties have very specific transit design, where it's like, if you want to go outside of this particular box, if it's very cumbersome. There's lots of red tape involved. Same thing in the private sector. In some communities, if you want to start a new taxi business, the cost to do that and the permitting and the insurance and those kind of things becomes very arduous in order to facilitate that small business growth and facilitation of filling a gap in the mobility. And so what I think, when I think about who's in charge and what policies they need to make to bring together, I think it's really around creating a space for the red tape to loosen a bit for these new business models to evolve, whether that be from a permitting perspective or that be from a route design perspective. I know in one particular project, we're looking at specifically unemployment. We have 2 transit agencies, we have 3 taxi providers, we have a specialty transportation provider that's actually a security company that does our 2, 3, 4 a.m. trips. And then we have the 5310, the Health and Human Services Transportation Provider. And all of us, no joke, for an entire year, met every week. And we walked through how we are going to work together to bring that to fruition. But it was led by the community regional planning organization for that particular organization, because they had that vested interest, but they were the ones who were having those conversations to say, hey, can we just put that particular piece of that project or that particular piece of this policy on hold for a minute and just try this out to see if we can get more people to work, to see if we can get more refugees and single moms jobs. And I think that's the piece about that facilitation. And I think the other piece to be in charge of is this co-opetition. I think it's very important for government entities who have kind of this, particular lens of equity to be ensured that they're overseeing some of these pieces, because the technology is essential, and the public transit, when the communities that have the public transit, is absolutely critical. But I think there's other dimensions of true mobility as a service and mobility on demand, such as coordination with the healthcare systems, coordinations with the senior centers, centers for independent living, the school systems, the veteran service offices, all those other pieces that actually could fund the rides into the mobility ecosystem need to be brought to the table. And the city or the community regional planning organization's ability to make those phone calls and get them to show up is much different than a private sector company many times making that phone call. So that's my 5 cents on that question.
Well, and Jeremey, let me toss it over to you, because I think you brought up something that was really interesting before, which was data. And this is really a question I think that probably goes across the board, and certainly Andy plays a role in this too, but you commented about data and data services being the piece that facilitates a lot of this, and the transit agencies, for instance, in Iowa, working to get off paper and pen for their scheduling, because a lot of people, if you want to easily plan a route, if you're doing it vis-a-vis this, you're going to have a data feed behind that shows you what kind of mobility you're accessing. And does everyone have that capacity? And is that an area in policy that you think makes a difference to be in charge?
Yes and no. I think the urban areas, it's very automatic. Everybody's connected. We have grocery delivery now. We've got everyone connected to Amazon delivery. I mean, we've gotten into that world, but here in transit, we're trying to keep up. We keep saying that on this panel. We're trying to keep up, and we're trying to put our arms around it. But how can we do that? How do we, as a system, we've forever and ever, we've been a 24-hour notice for reservation rides. And now everyone is so used to immediate use. We can't be a taxi service. That's not how it's designed. And to be efficient, we need to have multiple people on the bus at a time. And so that's where I think we're trying to really try to keep up. But I loved what Valerie said, because that was one of my notes, and that was a big battle with the urban rural. Especially the areas where we've got transit districts. And so when you've got an MPO area, they start eating up the suburbs. And so they are the designated transit provider. But in Iowa, we're by county. And so our transit agencies are county by county by county. And so you've got, let's just take the Des Moines Metro. They've got Polk County, but then they are surrounded completely by a rural provider. And so when the metro area grows into these suburbs, that's their area to serve. And so, but forever and ever, the rural provider has been that provider for that rural community that borders right up to the metro area. And then you've got this push and shove of who provides that trip. But then you've got the urban system that says, well, we'll provide a service to your community if you give us tax money, because that's our way of providing service. So then what? Then you've got this big gray area that's not provided because they fall within the metro area. They're not giving you a tax base, but then the rural provider's there. So that's one big thing that we were seeing a lot of. There's a lot of growing communities that it falls within the metro area. However, there's a big red tape. There's a big, the quote unquote who's in charge. I think that's where I don't know how it's going to change, because it's in FTA regulations, and so that's what we have to follow. And FTA will tell you, oh, you can have a cooperative agreement, you can have whatever, but still, why would the rural community do it, or the rural provider do it, when all the rides are given to the urban area, because that's their provided area? So what's the incentive for the rural provider to then contract with the metro provider when they're not even, they may get some contracted payment from it, but they're not getting the rides and miles that a lot of our transportation systems really rely on, is the rides and miles. So
money. Exactly.
There's a little bit there.
Yeah, and that's the federal side of this, and I think that's a great conversation that is starting to happen at the federal level, and we certainly work on this with the Mobility on Demand Alliance. As part of this is, how do you count mobility? We know we pay for what we value and what we count, and right now we count rides and trips. It typically isn't a fixed route kind of thing, and it's a very evolving system right now. But, you brought up something, and as we wrap ourselves up here in the last few minutes of this discussion, which is, and I'm going to transition very quickly to that other thing that we deliver, which is goods, and the idea of infrastructure on demand, goods on demand, and the nature of this and how it fits in a mobility on demand environment. I'll use a good example, for instance. Omaha actually just received a program where we're selected to participate in a curb management system program with a company called Coord, C-O-O-R-D, and where they're starting to think more effectively about the curb management. Curb management is obviously about individuals and mobility services like an Uber or Lyft dropping someone off, or taxi service, and maybe they're sitting in the the main traffic lane. But it is also about these delivery services. And I think and Andy, I'd be curious to your thoughts. When we talk about mobility on demand, the integration of moving things and people, goods and people, do you see that as an evolution, and are cities and others starting to weave that together in a seamless thing? You talked way at the very beginning about breaking down these silos and thinking holistically. Have we started doing that as an integration in MOD now?
I believe so. I think there's different places around the world who are sort of starting to dabble on how we break down those barriers. I think we were talking about freight, we're talking about ride hailing services, access to the curb space, everything associated with that. We're seeing almost like policy management coming into place now, where cities are being able to sort of charge for access to what is basically prime real estate. Be it sort of a bit of a curb space to sort of drop you off when you're getting out of your Uber, or be it sort of a freight delivery for a shop that sort of they need to park outside for half an hour to deliver that. There are prime examples going around the world at the moment. The one I would pick on is the work that's going on down in Sydney, where they've digitized their curb space. You now have access to a complete library of what is accessible at what times, but also more importantly, what it costs to basically sort of access that curb space at certain times. So you really can monetize, and it becomes a new income stream for the cities, which is always good. But it's a case of you can now monetize and sort of nudge people's behaviors. So if you don't want people being picked up and dropped off in the high street, but you want them being dropped 2 blocks away, you can financially incentivize people to do that. At the same time, you can use some of this money that you're collecting to incentivize other behaviors. So if you want people to sort of have a ride hailing service, sort of a shared ride hailing service into a city, you can sort of subsidize their journey to basically promote that activity over single use occupancy. It's all about sort of looking for the business models that work between the city and between the independent ride hailing service. And I think there are some really good examples coming out globally now of how cities are really sort of working together to sort of incentivize the behaviors that work across all of the different modes, and for both sort of private, public transportation and freight transportation.
Yeah, and as we close this up, I think really this integration of infrastructure on demand, operation services, and we didn't even get into that as we wrapped up. How you combine that with the customer service and the mobility service piece is really the element here that you're starting to see in this 2.0 and 3.0 as we go through. And let me close with this, with the last question, both to the people who are online and viewing this, and then I'm going to ask this question of my audience. And I'd love our online folks to, our attendees to be able to respond to this as well as you wanted. Okay, so this is the question, and maybe it's a yes, no. Is MOD and mobility as a service here to stay? And if so, what will make it successful? Is there any particular thing that we need to be able to do to make it successful? So Derek, maybe I'll kick it off with you. Is it here to stay? And is there one thing that we need to make sure that we're paying attention to make it successful?
Yes, absolutely. It is here to stay. It's the new normal for us. What do we need to do? I think we need to work better together to make it happen. Listen, we're all innovators, right? And it takes us, I always say innovation requires collaboration, right? That is my mantra here at First Transit. And I think that needs to continue to happen. There needs to be great ideas put into place, more pilots. It took Edison 1,000 times to figure out how to create a light bulb, and look what happened, right? So I think there's opportunity here when we do put our collective heads together and partner. And a partnership means we all work hand in hand together. We all, rising tide lifts all boats. You can go on to all the metaphors, but those are the things that I see are required.
Yeah. Jeremy, what do you think?
Yes, I agree that we all need to work together, but I think when it comes to rural communities, I think the innovation piece is going to have to be top notch. Currently, there's only one state that has their rural transit system on Google Maps, and so how can we move into that world? Because I think once we get rural communities, rural services on quote unquote the platform or some sort of service, then we can start moving into, okay, how do we plan this mobility on demand world? Because you go into Google Maps and you've got a plethora of options to get you around, and you go into certain cities, then there's even more options for mobility option. And so how can a person in rural America open up Google Maps and get the services that they need without, and how does everything talk together? So I mean, that's just a small example, but I think we need to understand what's happening rural, and the same rules don't apply to urban and rural. So we have to play that. We have to play both sides, I guess.
That's excellent. Valerie?
I think yes, definitely. We see MOD and MOS here to stay. I think one of the key things for the success and for the future is not to forget the investment that is currently being invested for the healthcare transportation. I think we spend as a nation between $10 to $15 billion a year on non-emergency medical transportation that is outside of our public transportation ecosystem for the vast majority. And so in enhancing mobility and looking at social determinants of health, we really need to ensure that when we're looking at our communities and our ecosystems for our individuals that need transportation outside of personal vehicle or what's the optimal service, it's also about ensuring that we're engaging those partners. I think the National Center for Mobility Management, or NCMM, put together a list of 130 different federal programs that fund transportation. And so the 5310, 5307, 5311 programs being a part of that, but there's a broad audience out there for enhancing mobility on demand and MOS through optimizing these experiences for not only the communities, but the passengers especially.
No, that's a great reminder, I think, about the outcomes of what we're talking about in mobility. It's easy to talk about just the tools and the technology, but really the outcomes that we want to focus on. I'm going to mention one of the comments that came in, and then Andy, I'm going to have you close it out. Here's the comment from one of our attendees. Yes, it is here to stay, and we need to understand what public policies are on intentionally constraining communities' ability to leverage private interests in mobility on demand. And I think that's a really good flag, is sort of these policy understandings. And Andy, maybe that's a great way to close it with you, given that you sort of raised some of that early on as well. But your thought, is it here to stay? And what do we need to make it successful?
Absolutely here to stay. Absolutely 100%. It's not going anywhere soon. I think one of the key things that we've got to sort of take on board is that we've got to be realistic. Mobility as a service is not going to turn up as an application that you're going to be sort of downloading on your smartphone and sort of subscribing to like they do in Finland. It really isn't that sort of level of mass, but it's incremental small steps. And we've got to be pragmatic about how things work. I'm all for sort of making mass and mod work in the rural environment, but the key thing that we're going to see is how it works in the urban environment. And if we can get private mobility service providers bought into delivering in urban environments, then we can roll that back to the sort of rural communities as well. It's about how we sort of expand the engagement instead of trying to do big bang overnight. We can't boil the ocean. I think one of the key things we need to do is start working on this policy. We need to try and understand what the policy implications are. We need to understand what policies can be delivered using mass and mobility on demand. And the only way to do that is to get a coherent voice and try and sort of sharing knowledge and sharing information. And the best way to do that is to join the Mobility on Demand Alliance and join the policy working group, roll up your sleeves and let's start writing some policy guidance.
Well, I didn't expect the plug at the end, but that's really nice of you, Andy, so thank you. But listen, someone here asked in the audience for me to rename you guys, the organizations you're with, so that they could follow on this. And so again, we have Andy Taylor is with Director of Strategy with Cubic. Valerie Lefler is the CEO of Feonix Mobility Rising. We have Derek Fretheim, who is the Director of Innovation with First Transit. And we have Jeremey Johnson Miller, who is now with the National Center of Aging and Disabilities Transportation. Sorry, I bungled that, Jeremey, but also the former State Mobility Coordinator with Iowa DOT. And I just want to say thank you for taking the time. We took exactly 60 minutes on our part of this presentation. I greatly appreciate the discussion, and in fact, I think this is one of the neatest ones I've had, and the conversations that we'd like to continue, especially in the region with ITS Heartland, as we all come back together, perhaps in person, to continue this conversation about what it takes regionally, policy-wise and others, to be able to do this. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. That was fantastic. I agree. We will definitely keep in touch and hopefully bring you and your partners back in the MOD Alliance to an ITS Heartland annual meeting when we can meet in person again. So I'm glad all of you were able to jump on. I know you guys are currently located all across the country in all time zones, so I appreciate you being able to attend today. That was great. All right, next we'll have two more vendor presentations. The first of the two is from Olsson. Olsson is a full-service engineering firm with offices throughout the Midwest and is also a sponsor of this webinar series. Olsson serves the entire ITS Heartland region and can help with technology, traffic, and ITS solutions. So take it away.
Olsson is a full-service civil design firm with services in engineering, environmental, field services, planning and design, and technology. We are a close-knit family of 1,300 employees spread throughout the Midwest, including many offices in the Heartland and around the country. Our experts are excellent resources for all things in transportation technology, from traditional ITS designs to TISMO and technology strategic planning, software services, and many unique, innovative solutions. We have significant experience with complex and innovative projects, including the planning, design, and implementation of citywide traffic signal systems, public and private communication systems, ITS systems, and software development for custom applications. we'd love to talk with you about traffic and transportation challenges you are facing. We are excited to brainstorm some innovative solutions with you.
Thanks, Angie. Our next vendor showcase and the last for today is from Street Smart Rental, which is another vendor sponsor of the webinar series. Street Smart is a nationwide full-service smart work zone integration provider. From system design to equipment rental, they have 21 years of experience helping DOTs, consultants, and traffic safety companies create safer, smarter highway work zones. All right, thank you. So our last presentation today is our Missouri State update from Alex Wassman, ITS Heartland's Missouri State Director. Alex is a traffic management and operations engineer with the Missouri Department of Transportation and has been for almost 14 years. Alex graduated from the University of Missouri with a bachelor's in civil engineering, and Alex has been involved with ITS Heartland for a number of years. So Alex, I'm excited to hear what is going on from you and across the state of Missouri at MoDOT.
Hello and welcome to the 2020 Missouri State Update. I am Alex Wassman. I'll be doing the update for you today. I'm a traffic management.
And Slade, I think we lost you. All right, we'll get this going again. Sorry about that.
Hello and welcome to the 2020 Missouri State Update. I am Alex Wassman. I'll be doing the update for you today. I'm a traffic management and operations engineer with the Missouri Department of Transportation, and I am the current ITS Heartland Missouri State Director. First thing I want to talk to you about today is the TSMO plan implementation. MoDOT's TSMO plan was originally completed in 2017 with the help of Olsson. That initial plan was a framework which included 4 different groups of actions needed to increase MoDOT's TSMO capabilities. We decided to combine 2 of the groups and focus on 3 main areas first to move MoDOT forward. The 3 implementation teams were formed, 1 for each group, to ensure that our plan was put to good use. These groups are shown on the screen here. They were advancing TSMO, work zone management, and traffic incident management. First up, I'll give a progress update on what the advancing TSMO team has been working on, what they accomplished. The first thing that they chose to work on was to educate and equip our planning and design staff to consistently implement TSMO into our processes at the statewide and district levels. That starts with reviewing the existing planning and design processes and seeing where we have gaps, what kind of modifications we can do to our processes and documents to include the missing TSMO items. After updating these documents, our goal is to train staff and have the TSMO processes that we are promoting be just a natural part of MoDOT's everyday processes. The second item that they are working on is establishing a TSMO position within each district. When we first embarked on this, we were going back and forth on whether we wanted to do a TSMO position or a committee. We landed on position somewhat because we thought that one person generally is going to have more authority than if there's a group of people who there's not one given decision maker. Next up, establish TSMO performance measurement metrics and goals at the statewide and district levels. Now, MoDOT already has performance measures, so this would involve reviewing our existing measures and determining what needs to be added or subtracted from our statewide and district level tracker measures. Fourth, establish a connected and automated vehicle corridor in Missouri. Now, establishing a CAV corridor is a pretty tall task, so we recently decided to form a fourth team to dedicate solely to this. We splintered off some members of the Advancing TSMO team, but we also added some outside members from elsewhere in MoDOT to give us a hand. Next up is work zone management. The first priority item was to develop and enhance policies for when and how to utilize law enforcement officers in our work zones. As part of this effort, as you can see on the screen, the team developed a one-page front and back handout with examples of how to set up on the front and then a blank work zone on the back to fill in how to set up in a specific location. And this could be filled out in the field just roughly in pen, coordinating between the law enforcement officer and MoDOT construction staff to pick out the best location for them. Second, increase contractor involvement in work zone traffic control. MoDOT put together a list of our top 5 non-compliant items that we see in the field, as well as picture examples of each of them. We also provide links to all the relevant standards and documents that govern work zone on our roadways on the second page. The third item is to develop procedures to identify work zone funding early in the planning and design process. And the fourth item is to review and implement new work zone technologies. Now, one other noteworthy item that this team produced was a map to identify priority corridors and segments for the application of advanced work zone technologies. This was done by combining and weighting the congestion and accident rates on our major routes, and was done with some assistance from our planning department. The third group is traffic incident management. Their first goal is to review existing TIM documents and update them to accurately reflect MoDOT's priorities and commitment to traffic incident management and TSMO. The first area of focus was to create a draft of an MOU that would outline quick clearance objectives and strategies to improve safety and mobility at incident scenes. The second goal of the traffic incident management team is to complete a strategic planning review of organizational structure within MoDOT to support traffic incident management. MoDOT's TIM structure is more well-defined in the urban areas than the rural currently. The team would like to better define the TIM structure statewide. Then also, they determined that they would like to establish a TIM coordinator in each district. Currently, there is only a full-time coordinator in the St. Louis, Kansas City, and Springfield regions. Number 3, establish regional TIM committees on interstate corridors and at the statewide, regional, and metro/local levels. So the aforementioned TIM coordinators would help establish these regional TIM committees, as well as run CMN exercises, capability and maturity model. The fourth item is to establish regional TIM committees on interstate corridors and at statewide, regional, and metro and local levels. Next up, I'm going to get into a few projects that MoDOT has undertaken in the last year and a half or so since we've had our previous meeting. First up is to update on one that I spoke to last time, real-time digital warnings for Haas and Makeway. KC Scout and Gateway Guide in St. Louis have continued working with Haas and Makeway Safety to provide notifications to motorists approaching emergency response vehicles. These alerts are triggered when our ER trucks have their emergency lights turned on. The warnings are then delivered to approaching vehicles through third-party apps such as Waze, also through built-in in-dash systems. We now have the majority of our emergency response vehicles, if not all of them, equipped with the devices in those regions. We have begun expanding the installations to include some other vehicles like TMAs that we use to protect workers. It's too early and definitely too small of a sample to draw any conclusions, but there was a 40% decrease in third-party crashes with ER vehicles in the first year of use in the St. Louis region. So definitely very promising, but time will tell if that was somewhat related to the lower volumes due to COVID, or if those improvements will stick. Next project is in the Southwest District. We have a DMS maintenance and repair project coming up. I am showing a color DMS on the slide, and the original idea was to retrofit the DMS with color panels, but the size of the boards is not large enough to house all the components necessary. So instead, it was kind of back to the drawing board. And so we're putting out a bid for a maintenance project to fix the broken panels and other various issues for 20 of our DMS in that Southwest area. Next up, the Regional Integrated Data Sharing Initiative, or RIDSI for short. This is a project in the St. Louis metro area. This project is done in coordination with our partners in St. Charles County. This need was actually identified as part of the regional ITS architecture update undertaken a few years ago. The data sharing project is being done with the University of Missouri-Columbia and integrated into their Titan platform. The project's currently in phase 1. All the organizations are providing their data feeds, and I believe that the University of Missouri is working on how to normalize and combine everything. So the platform itself is split up into 3 different sections: interactive dashboards, a data center, and predictive analytics. And there is actually data in each of these sections already that can be viewed by the public. So if anyone wants, they can go to that mizzou-titan.com and check it out for themselves. There's some demo data in there from a couple of years ago. And the website on the screen is probably available without a login if you want to go see. Next up, the Scout ITS Network and Telecommunications Consultant Contract. So Scout is going out for a consultant solicitation for this. Gary Covey has been the IT consultant working full-time at Scout for over 10 years. Unfortunately for us, but really great for him, is that he's retiring in June of next year. So Scout will soon be releasing that consultant sign solicitation. We're hoping to receive some great consultant responses. So for any of those of you out there who are listening and are interested, please keep an eye out for this on our website. Next up, this one's kind of hot off the presses. CCTV management software upgrade. That software is Genetech Security Desk. So we just finished upgrading our servers, the web interface, and the mobile app for the statewide security desk system. This system is used to view and control cameras for internal users, and also view-only access is shared with our partners in law enforcement, emergency management, and news stations, among others. We've been working really hard with our IS department to finish this in the last couple weeks. So now that we just had the system go live, we're kind of trying to squash bugs as they pop up. So we have a couple of procurements that are either currently happening or going to happen soon. First, our vehicle probe data contract. We're finishing up the selection process now, and we'll have a probe data contract in place by the end of the year. I wish I could tell you who that will be, but unfortunately I cannot announce the winner yet, but we will do so soon. And then also our ATMS system will be going out to bid in summer of 2021. Our ATMS contracts are up next fall. So we will be out for a solicitation sometime, probably bordering the spring and summer of next year. It has been a while since we went out for bid, so it will be very interesting to see what is available and what all the new technology is out there. That's all for today. I just want to thank everybody for the time and letting me present today. And I put my name and some contact information on this last slide. So if anybody has any questions or wants to contact me about any of this stuff, feel free to do so. Thanks again.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Sounds like there's a lot going on in Missouri, so thank you for sharing all that information. ITS Heartland, that is the last of our presentations for this, the fourth session of 5 for our 2020 ITS Heartland virtual webinar series. We do have one more week in our series, but please note it'll be November 18th. We are skipping next week due to the Veterans Day holiday. So please make note of that on your calendar. I also want to highlight again that our 2021 annual meeting has been moved to the fall to November 8th through the 10th. The board decided to move this already to the fall to have the best chance of all of us meeting in person next year. So please save these dates, and hopefully we'll see everyone in Overland Park next year. With that, have a great rest of your day, great rest of your week, and we'll see you on the 18th. All right, thank you. Thank you for attending.